What's up, sophomores? Mr. Tomei out here, chilling with a nice little water stain because I don't know how to drink water. Coming at you live from undisclosed location in my mansion. You know how it is out here. Just got done driving around the Lamborghini. You know how it is. So let's go over a couple things. First off, quick announcement for those of you that are watching this video. I highly recommend checking in with your teachers about how they're handling their grading going forward. I'm respecting the policy that the district sent out, and my interpretation of that policy is what I put in the classroom on May 4th. So if you have questions about that, I thought I made it pretty clear. Go ahead and let me know. But if I were you, I'd really check in with each and one of your teachers just to make sure you understand where you're at and you understand what you have to do to get the grade or the credit that you want. You know what I'm saying? So make sure you take care of that. But as for this class, we just finished our that's government econ. We just finished our Cold War unit. Today's video is all going to be about, let me share it, is all going to be about reviewing for a test. Yay. Okay. So I'm going to go over the study guide with y'all. And boom, there's the test. Oh wait, it's gone. Boom, 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 boom. Haha. So we're going to go over the study guide and maybe I'll go over some of the test stuff with you, TBD. So let's knock it out. First off, know what countries make up NATO and which ones make up the Warsaw Pact, right? This is one of the first things we learned about. Countries that make up Western Europe and the United States are going to make up NATO. Again, NATO stands for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Countries that are in Eastern Europe and are supportive of the Soviet Union make up the Warsaw Pact. After the war, right, Germany gets split up, Berlin gets split up. If you fall on the eastern side or the Soviet-occupied areas of Europe, you became part of the Warsaw Pact, whether you wanted to or not. And then if you were more on the British, American, French side, which was occupied and by those countries in Western Europe, you were a NATO member. So that's kind of how that broke down. And that kind of leads into the Marshall Plan, the Berlin Airlift. So the Marshall Plan was an American plan to help rebuild Europe because they felt it was for the best interests of the global economy that Europe was rebuilt. But the deal with that is the Marshall Plan only really affected Western European countries. The United States had no interest in helping rebuild Warsaw Pact or Eastern European countries who were under the occupation or allies with the Soviet Union, because the United States knew that the Soviet Union was the only other superpower to challenge them, and they didn't want to give the Soviet Union or their allies any sort of assistance. So this was kind of the very beginnings of the Cold War. Kind of as a response of like tensions between the Western Europeans in the US and the Warsaw members, there was the Berlin blockade. The Soviet Union decided to set up a blockade around the entire city of Berlin because there was a push for Germany to reunify, but the Soviet Union didn't want to do that. And so they put a blockade around the capital city. Soviet Union had no problems about treating the people of Berlin poorly or the Eastern Germans that they had control over poorly because of what happened in World War II and how Hitler and the Nazi Party of Germany treated Soviet and communist people. So it was kind of like a revenge in a way. But in the end, the Western European countries in the United States weren't going to sit by and just let the people of Berlin starve and die. So we held the Berlin airlift. Took place over a year. It helped get supplies into the city. The Soviet Union wasn't really going to try and shoot down the planes and lead us into a war, of World War III. So the Soviet Union kind of backed off, let off the blockade. But the Soviet Union would get their revenge when the Berlin Wall comes up not too much long after. we got to know about what MAD stands for. MAD is mutually assured destruction. At this time, the United States and the Soviet Union were the only two countries that had nuclear weapons. That's what really made them the two superpowers of the world. At that time, had we ever gone to an actual war against the Soviet Union, because we had nuclear weapons, it would have been very easy just to launch nuclear weapons at the Soviet Union, but then they could have launched back and then we would have launched back. And eventually, as I've mentioned before, it doesn't take too many nuclear weapons to like end the world, especially the ones that were being developed after World War II, which were much bigger than what was dropped on Hiroshima or Nagasaki. So the idea was, if it ever did get to like a nuclear war, like between the United States and Soviet Union, it would result in the end of the war. So it was a mad belief, like crazy, that we would be willing to do that. And MAD also is an acronym for mutually, like they both know, assured, guaranteed, it's going to happen, destruction, right? So yeah, let's go to the Chinese Civil War. Know about who won the Chinese Civil War. This is really important because this is kind of how China has developed to modern day China. The communists win the Civil War in China. The communists were obviously supported by the Soviet Union, who wanted to see a big country like China fall under like communist rule. The US-backed nationalist side fled to Taiwan. You can go back and learn about their relationship in the video that we went over in the Chinese Civil War. But this is really important because then China developed for the past 70 years as a communist country, and the freedoms and politics and cultural values have been impacted by a legacy and a history of communist like kind of oppression in economies and governments. And so that's just kind of important to understand about like Chinese culture, history, and their role kind of on the international like scale of being, you know, China's emerged as kind of a new world power over the past 20 years. And so it's important to understand kind of how they got there in their history. Next, know about the Korean Civil War. This is why there's two Koreas today. The Soviet Union, after World War II, during World War II, Korea was occupied by Japan. When Japan was defeated, the Soviet Union got the northern part of Korea, and the United States and the Western kind of allies got the southern part. Again, there's a argument of how Korea should like come together, should be a communist country or a democratic capitalist country. And of course, we got to go to war. So North and South Korea go to war. North Korea is supported by the Chinese now, who are a brand new communist country, and the Soviet Union, whereas the US and other Western allies support the South. It's kind of a stalemate war. No one really either gains a lot of progress. So the final agreement is that there's going to be two Koreas, communist North Korea and then capitalist South Korea. As a result, the two Koreas have kind of diverged on a very different path. South Korea is a very prosperous country, very technologically advanced, very modern, very capitalist. A lot of big companies come out of South Korea. A lot of liberty and democracy that exists there. Whereas North Korea fell down the path of kind of radical communism. They have, obviously, you've probably heard about their leader, Kim Jong-un. Is he dead? Is he alive? But the point is, they have like dictatorial leadership. It's authoritarian government. There's very limited freedoms. There's little to no innovation. People live kind of in abject poverty because there's just no like real business, because North Korea has alienated themselves from almost the entire world. China's their really only ally, and without China, North Korea would probably collapse. And so North Korea is kind of known as the hermit kingdom because they are kind of in their shell. No one really knows much about there. It's nearly impossible to travel there as an American. And compared to the rest of the world, it's a unique case of a place in the world that like isn't caught up to the realities of where we're at now in 2020. And so that's the legacy kind of the Korean Civil War. That's what I want you to know about. Know about the Cuban Revolution and missile crisis. For many years, Cuba was under the influence and really kind of the low-key control of the United States. We supported a bad dictator there named Florencio Batista. And a lot of people in Cuba were oppressed. Um, a guy by the name of Fidel Castro comes with power. He's well educated, good speaker. He rallies the poor, the farmers, to lead a revolution. Um, he uses the theories of communism, which he had learned about in his education, to kind of base the rationale for his new ideas to how to rebuild Cuba. Obviously, the Soviet Union is like, yeah, go for it. This is great. You know, this is going to be a communist country that's right next to the United States. We can use that as leverage. And so the Cuban Revolution occurs. Cuba goes through a communist transformation and they become a communist country. Then we get to the Cuban Missile Crisis. I told you to watch a video about that. It was about 5 minutes. Go back in the slides if you haven't to watch it. The Soviet Union now knows they have a huge leverage piece against the United States because a country that's less than 60 miles away from the coast of Florida is now a place they can use to their advantage. And so the Soviet Union tries to put nuclear missiles in Cuba as like a kind of a passive aggressive like threat to the United States. And then the United States like, oh, you're going to do that? It's going to be like that. So then we're like talking about having our missiles in Turkey and Italy, like pointed at Moscow. And it's like the closest we've ever been to nuclear war. But cooler heads prevail. Soviet Union withdraws their nukes from Cuba. We withdraw our nukes from like bordering countries of the Soviet Union, like Italy and Turkey and whatnot. And cooler heads prevail, and like we don't die. Shout out, peace, because we wouldn't be here today if things had gone south or communication had dropped. Let's talk about the Berlin Wall, why it was built. The Berlin Wall is a kind of a symbol for the Iron Curtain. It's also a symbol of the divide between West and East Berlin, and really the communist world and the capitalist world. The Berlin Wall was kind of built like overnight. It separated the city of Berlin randomly, separated families. The Berlin Wall was up for almost 30, 40 years. And it was at one point probably one of the more dangerous borders in the world. The Berlin Wall was used as a way to trap people, not so much keep people out, but trap people in East Berlin, because people in East Berlin saw what life was like under communist rule. And so the great minds, the doctors, the really intellectual people who were very valuable to the Soviet Union, right, and to the East Germany and East Berliners, those people, the intellects, they knew they wanted to get out because there were more opportunities in the West. And so the Soviet Union's like, yo, we got to stop this or we're not going to have any talented quality people left. So really the wall, which a lot of times you think of walls to keep people out, it was really more so you could make the argument to keep people in and force them to live under oppression. So that's kind of the history about the Berlin Wall. It fell as the Soviet Union collapsed, which we'll get into. And when the Berlin Wall fell, that's when Germany like reunified as a whole country again, back in the early 90s. The Vietnam War, you'll learn a lot about this in U.S. history, but just to give you the brief breakdown, similar to what was happening in Korea, the northern part of the country kind of became more fell in the favor of like communist beliefs and practices, and we're kind of down for that, whereas the South wanted to be more capitalist. Again, we're going to have a civil war, so the Chinese, the Soviet Union, supported the North, and the capitalist countries supported the South. Very bloody war. It really changed the way we think about wars, in terms of like how effective they are and what the United States role is in fighting wars. In terms of, and you'll learn a lot about more of that in the U.S., but in terms of its legacy and kind of how we take it from the rest of the world, Vietnam is another country that went through a pretty, drastic communist transformation. Many people in the South who supported the capitalist Vietnam had to flee Vietnam for the fear of their lives. So many Vietnamese came to California during the 70s and whatnot. That was when we saw a really big spike in Vietnamese immigration here. Vietnam was a communist country for a while. Vietnam has shifted in more recent years, become more capitalist, but still culturally in Vietnam, there are things that are going to be very different than what you would see in the United States because of the communist oppressive government that they have in Vietnam. uh, know about guerrilla warfare. That's another part of the Vietnam War. It's the idea of, instead of having like soldiers and like uniforms and ranks and following like orders, it's more about like, yo, we're like group of five of us with these random weapons, and we're gonna like do things like Call of Duty, like ambush, kill, sabotage, drop bombs, run away. Is more of hit and run attacks instead of like massive, overwhelming army support. The United States easily could have won the Vietnam War, but it would have come at a huge cost to not only American lives, but they would have had to wipe out a lot of civilian, innocent people in Vietnam, and no one was for that. And that's what made guerrilla warfare successful, because the Vietnam, like guerrilla war fighters, knew they would outlast the American army. They knew the territory, and they were willing to, fight for a long time because they knew they would outlast the United States resolve, and that's what helped them win the war. Okay, next one. Who won the space race? For a long time, the Soviet Union was always one step ahead of us, but then America, we got to the moon first, and it was a huge moment for us. It effectively kind of, we won the space race. Because of the space race, it also really pushed technological advancements and like scientific research and capabilities. So like, we know more in that time period, in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, we learned so much about science and like space and whatnot. One of the greatest periods of like technological scientific advancement in recent modern history. What's the irony of the America arming rebels in Afghanistan? Afghanistan was another country that almost fell to the communist rule. The United States didn't want that. We armed rebels in Afghanistan who wanted to set up like a more capitalist country. The irony is, of course, those people, some of which came to follow Osama bin Laden, who then carried out 9/11, which is one of the most important events of the 21st century that's really changed the world. So that's kind of ironic. Perestroika and Glasnost, excuse me. Perestroika and Glasnost are both reforms. Perestroika is the restructuring. That's the economic reforms. And then Glasnost is the political diplomacy reform between the Soviet Union and the United States. This was enacted by Mikhail Gorbachev as kind of a measure to help restore the Soviet Union's power, because the Soviet Union was kind of imploding. And that has to do with, when we get to the why did the Soviet Union fall, we'll understand why it kind of imploded. Know at least 3 countries that were created because of the fall of the Soviet Union. So Germany technically would count because it was a new reunified country. You'd say Latvia, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, Belarus, Estonia. There's a bunch. It's in the slide map. Just look there and you can find it. Why did the Soviet Union fall? Because communism doesn't work over a long period of time. Communism, there's no desire for competition. There's no reason to work hard. Therefore, you're not going to see technological innovation, medical innovation. There's just no desire to really, there's no need if everyone's paid the same. If a doctor's paid the same as a janitor, if a researcher's paid the same as a janitor, they're not going to work as hard. They're not going to push the envelope on what is capable in science, business, technology. So eventually economies stagnate and there's no growth. But if there's no growth and a population keeps growing, that means there's less money per person now, and there's less resources per person. And so a huge country like the Soviet Union, which had so much territory and a large population, really started to implode because of the practices of communism. And that was ultimately their downfall. It worked for them for a while, and it worked, it was great for the people, it made them equal, but it's not sustainable in the long run. Eventually, as the rest of the world pulled away, the Soviet Union began to implode. And then know about socialism. Socialism is the between capitalism and communism. Again, understand that communism is at one end of the scale, capitalism is at the other end, and the majority of countries in the world fit somewhere in the middle, and we would call that socialism. The United States is a socialist country. We are very capitalist leaning in our values, in our policies, and whatnot, in our culture. But we're a socialist country. You can get, public education is completely paid for by the government. That's a pretty communist ideal that's supposed to keep everyone on the level playing field. Same thing with like Medicare and Medicaid and things like that. Government benefits like SNAP, like food stamps and whatnot. No difference between capitalism and communism. Capitalism is, survival of the fittest. It's all about competition. It's all about supply and demand. May the best business win. It drives innovation and technology and technological advancements, which is kind of the pros about it. But the cons, there's going to be a huge wealth gap and inequality that's going to exist because there are going to be winners in that system, like mega winners. Think of like the billionaires, right? America has more billionaires than anywhere else in the world. And then there's going to be like the uber poor. Think of like people who are homeless and people who have like very little, So inequality is rampant in a capitalist society. You look at communism, it's the opposite. Communism is more about making sure everyone's treated the same, everyone's paid the same, everyone has the same access to everything. So no one could have more of an advantage or be at a disadvantage than someone else. This is why a doctor and a janitor are paid the same. Or everyone has the same size house and there's only like one telephone company, or there's only like one cheeseburger company, right? You only have limited options. So there's limited options, but everyone has a ton. The equality is rampant. It's very equal. There's no inequality. It's very equal. The cons, though, is because everything is so equal, there's really no desire for people to try and work harder and push the envelope to try and advance technology and business and grow their business and invest in their business. So over time, your economy stagnate. And then what happens is you're going to see, limited growth. You're going to see kind of just a lack of kind of like desire of wanting to do things. And unfortunately, that growth really hurts these places because although they have a ton of inequality, the lack of growth really makes life hard for the overwhelming majority of the population who are equal, but are all equal kind of in like middling lower poverty. Communism just doesn't work in the long run. And then my last note there is always remember the Soviet Union, Warsaw Pact support anyone who's communist, and the US and NATO support anyone who's capitalist. Okay. Besides that, okay, that's kind of the main stuff I just want you to get away from this unit. Okay. The ultimate legacy is that the puppet strings that we pulled in wars in countries around the world to try and influence them to either be communist or capitalist have drastically changed the international landscape of politics, business, and a country's history. And it set up kind of the way the world is today in many ways. We're still feeling the effects of the Cold War in trying to, how do we handle countries like North Korea who are like trying to be having like nuclear weapons? Like, how do we interact with China? We don't really have the best relationship with them because they were a communist country, but there's no denying that China is one of the most powerful countries in the world now. They're a real superpower. They're kind of more of a real threat than they've ever been. How do we do that? How do we handle that? And so there's a lot of questions that still stem from the fall of the Cold War. So that's that. That's kind of our review, our wrap up about the Cold War. Be on the lookout next week for a test that I'm going to put up. If you want to test yourself, do it. You might as well. You're going to have to learn this stuff in U.S. history anyways. It's just, if you got nothing else to do, it is good to at least practice it. Test shouldn't take you more than 30 minutes, I'd imagine. And yeah, okay. If you have any questions in the meantime, ask me, holler at me. Tome out. Keep it easy.